deep in the heart of Siberia, beyond the vast, snow-covered landscapes and endless taiga forests, exists a people whose DNA holds secrets that scientists are only beginning to unravel. The Siberian Tatars, one of the most enigmatic ethnic groups in the world, are unlike any other population. Their DNA is a fascinating puzzle, a genetic fingerprint that doesn't fully align with any single ancestry. They are classified as Tatars, yet their genetic legacy tells a story far older and more complex than simple Turkic or Mongol descent. What makes their DNA so unique? And why do they stand apart from other Turkic-speaking populations? For centuries, historians and researchers have debated their origins. Unlike the Volga Tatars or the Crimean Tatars, the Siberian Tatars did not emerge from a single migration wave. Instead, their lineage weaves together ancient indigenous Siberian tribes, Uralic-speaking hunter-gatherers, and Turkic nomads who arrived much later. They are one of the oldest inhabitants of Siberia, predating even the Mongol conquests. Unlike other Turkic groups, their DNA carries deep traces of Paleo-Siberian ancestry, with genetic markers linking them to forgotten civilizations that once roamed the icy wilderness. But what truly sets them apart is their extreme genetic diversity. Studies have shown that Siberian Tatars have some of the highest levels of genetic differentiation among Central Asian and Siberian ethnic groups. Every subgroup within them tells a different story. Some show close connections to Ugric and Samoyedic tribes, others to the Caucasus, while some retain ancient markers only found in Arctic populations. This isn't just an isolated anomaly, it's a genetic bridge between civilizations, an echo of migrations that shaped human history. Their DNA also challenges long-held myths. Many believe the Siberian Tatars were direct descendants of the Mongols, yet modern genetic research has completely shattered this assumption. Despite the historical influence of the Mongol Empire, Siberian Tatar DNA reveals only a weak trace, just 2%, of Central Asian ancestry. This means they were never fully assimilated into the Mongol gene pool, but instead retained their unique genetic identity. Their lineage is not one of conquest, but of survival, adaptation, and preservation. Another surprising discovery is how their genetic heritage contradicts their language. While they speak a Kipchak Turkic language, their DNA suggests they are not predominantly Turkic in origin. Instead, their genetic markers show deeper connections to the indigenous Siberian population, proving that a language shift occurred at some point in history. Rather than being a people who migrated and displaced others, they absorbed cultural influences while keeping their genetic roots intact. So what does this all mean? The Siberian Tatars are a living genetic time capsule, preserving fragments of Siberia's ancient past. Their DNA provides a crucial link between early Eurasian populations, shedding light on human migration patterns that have long been lost to history. From the Arctic tundra to the Central Asian steppes, their genes tell a story of endurance, complexity, and mystery. The Siberian Tatars are unlike any other ethnic group in the world. While they are classified as Tatars, their origins set them apart. Unlike the Volga or Crimean Tatars, they did not migrate from distant lands. Instead, they emerged directly from the Siberian landscape, shaped by its harsh climate, ancient tribes, and a complex web of migrations that stretch back thousands of years. They are not just a people. They are the living remnants of civilizations that existed before written history, before the rise of great empires, and long before the Mongols swept across the steppe. They are the largest Turkic-speaking group in western Siberia, but calling them purely Turkic ignores a much deeper reality. Their ancestors were not just Kipchaks or Mongols, but included indigenous Siberian tribes, early Ugric and Samoyedic groups, and even mysterious Paleo-Siberians whose genetic traces still linger within them today. What makes them even more unique is that they are not a singular, unified people. Instead, they are divided into three major subgroups, each with its own genetic identity. The Tobalar-Tish Tatars are the most numerous, scattered across Tyumen, Omsk, and Kurgan. They bear the marks of indigenous Siberian ancestry, but also show genetic links to Volga Tatars and other Turkic groups that migrated into the region. Meanwhile, the Baraba Tatars have a completely different story. Living in the vast Baraba steppe, their genetic structure is heavily influenced by Siberian hunter-gatherers and early Uralic-speaking populations, showing a much stronger connection to ancient tribes then to later Turkic migrations. And then there are the Tatars, a group that has retained rare genetic markers linking them to Mongolic and early Central Asian groups, yet with a distinct identity that sets them apart from both. This complex structure proves one thing: Siberian Tatars did not emerge from a single event or a single migration. They are a layered people, formed over centuries of interaction between native Siberian populations and later arrivals from the west, south, and east. This also explains why no single genetic study has ever been able to classify them under one category. Instead, they remain a hybrid people, a genetic mosaic of civilizations that have long vanished from history. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their identity is how they have preserved their distinctiveness despite centuries of external influences. They survived the Mongol invasion without being genetically absorbed into the Mongol Empire. They resisted full assimilation into Russian society, even as Siberia became a key part of the Russian Empire. And despite sharing cultural similarities with other Tatar groups, their DNA still retains a unique signature that cannot be found anywhere else. So when we ask, who are the Siberian Tatars? The answer is not simple. They are not a single people but a collection of histories, migrations, and adaptations. They are the descendants of forgotten tribes, the carriers of ancient Siberian bloodlines, and the product of a land that has shaped them for thousands of years. Their DNA is more than just a genetic code. It is a living archive of the past, a direct link to the earliest humans who braved the Siberian wilderness and left behind a legacy that still survives today. For centuries, Siberia has been a crossroads of civilizations, but few groups embody this complexity as profoundly as the Siberian Tatars. While their culture and language tie them to the Turkic world, their DNA tells a completely different story. They are not a singular people, but a population shaped by an intricate blend of ancient Siberian tribes, Uralic-speaking hunter-gatherers, and the waves of nomadic migrations that swept across Eurasia. What truly sets them apart is their genetic makeup, a striking contrast to other Tatars and even to neighboring Siberian ethnic groups. Unlike other Turkic populations, who typically have a dominant genetic ancestry from steppe nomads, the Siberian Tatars are an anomaly. Their DNA reveals extraordinary diversity, with levels of genetic variation higher than most Central Asian or Turkic-speaking groups. Some subgroups show deep connections to the indigenous populations of Siberia, while others carry traces of ancient migrations from Western Asia or even the Arctic. Each subgroup has a distinct genetic signature, proving that their ancestry is not the result of a single event, but a continuous process of adaptation and survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. One of the most unexpected discoveries in their genetic studies is that two completely unrelated lineages coexist within their gene pool, one deeply Siberian, the other linked to nomadic steppe tribes. This means their ancestors followed two very different evolutionary paths before merging into a single population. Some carry DNA closely related to Arctic and Uralic groups, proving a long-standing presence in Siberia, while others have genetic markers that match Turkic and even Iranian-speaking nomads who arrived much later. This fusion of ancient and more recent genetic influences has made them one of the most distinct populations in all of Eurasia. Another key factor in their uniqueness is the clear regional differences within their own population. The Iskir-Tobol Tatars, for example, show significant genetic similarities to Volga Tatars, suggesting a degree of contact with more Western Turkic groups. However, the Unauthorized Tatars carry a genetic imprint from the Caucasus, indicating historical interactions with populations far beyond Siberia. Meanwhile, the Ishtiak-Tokas Tatars hold a genetic legacy that links them to Paleo-Siberians, making them direct descendants of some of Siberia's earliest inhabitants. And then there are the Zabolotny Tatars, who, despite being classified as Tatars, show a genetic connection to Ugric peoples and Samoyedic tribes, rather than Turkic groups. This diversity within a single ethnic group is almost unheard of. What makes these findings even more intriguing is that Siberian Tatars lacked a strong Mongol genetic influence, despite historical records linking them to the Mongol Empire. While many groups across Eurasia were heavily impacted by Mongol expansion, genetic analysis has shown that Siberian Tatars have only about 2% Mongolic ancestry, a shockingly low percentage for a people historically assumed to have been part of the Mongol world. This means that while the Mongols may have influenced their culture and history, they did not significantly alter their genetic makeup. This discovery challenges long-standing theories about their origins and proves that their story is far older than the Mongol conquests. The Siberian Tatars are not simply an ethnic group. They are a genetic bridge between civilizations, a living record of migrations and interactions that shaped Eurasia. Their DNA holds answers to questions about ancient population movements, lost cultures, and the survival of indigenous Siberian peoples through millennia of change. Unlike many other ethnic groups, who can trace their origins to a specific place or event, the Siberian Tatars are the result of countless generations adapting to an ever-changing world. They are a testament to resilience, diversity, and the enduring complexity of human history. The genetic identity of the Siberian Tatars is not just unique. It's a mystery that rewrites what we thought we knew about Siberia's past. Unlike many Turkic-speaking groups, their DNA doesn't point to a single origin, but to a complex fusion of vastly different ancestral lineages. While their language connects them to the broader Turkic world, their genetic code ties them to populations scattered across the vast expanse of Eurasia, from the Arctic tundra to the mountains of the Caucasus. One of the most fascinating aspects of their genetic structure is how it defies traditional classification. They are officially recognized as Tatars, yet genetic studies reveal that their paternal and maternal lineages differ significantly from Volga and Crimean Tatars. Their Y-DNA, which traces paternal ancestry, shows an unusually high frequency of NM231, a haplogroup that is most common among Uralic-speaking peoples and indigenous Siberian tribes. This contradicts the idea that they are simply a Turkic group that migrated to Siberia. Rather, they appear to be direct descendants of ancient Siberian populations who later adopted Turkic languages. But what makes their Y-DNA particularly unusual is its extreme regional variation. Different subgroups of Siberian Tatars have drastically different paternal lineages, proving that their ancestors did not come from a single migration but from multiple, unrelated groups. The Zabolotny Tatars, for instance, have a genetic profile that aligns them with Ugric and Samoyedic peoples rather than Turkic populations. Meanwhile, the Baraba Tatars display a high frequency of Q-L330, a haplogroup that links them to early Siberian hunter-gatherers and even some Native American populations, suggesting an ancient connection between the peoples of Siberia and those who crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago. Perhaps even more surprising is the presence of R1A, Z93 among the Tom Tatars, a lineage associated with Indo-Iranian steppe nomads. This suggests that some Siberian Tatar ancestors were not originally Turkic, but may have been related to early Iranian-speaking peoples who once roamed the Central Asian steppes. This is further supported by the presence of J2 and G2A haplogroups in certain Siberian Tatar groups, which are more commonly found in the Caucasus and Western Asia. These markers suggest that long before the Mongols or the Kipchaks arrived, there were already diverse populations living in Siberia, blending and adapting over millennia. While their paternal lineages show extensive diversity, their maternal lineages tell a slightly different story. Unlike their fathers, who came from various backgrounds, the maternal DNA of the Siberian Tatars is overwhelmingly East Eurasian. The presence of haplogroups C, D, G, and M7 indicates that their maternal ancestors were closely related to indigenous Siberians and even some Arctic populations. This means that while their paternal lineage was shaped by waves of nomadic migrations, their maternal lineage remained deeply rooted in Siberia, proving that their ancestors were not simply newcomers, but had lived in the region for thousands of years. This contrast between paternal and maternal ancestry is rare and suggests a unique historical pattern. It indicates that Siberian Tatar men descended from a variety of groups, Turkic, Ugric, Iranian, and Siberian, but their mothers were primarily from the indigenous Siberian population. This is a strong indication that the Siberian Tatars, rather than being a single ethnic group, are the result of complex intermarriages between different populations over centuries. This distinct genetic makeup challenges everything we thought we knew about their history. It suggests that their ancestors were among the first people to inhabit Siberia, and that rather than being replaced by later migrations, they absorbed new populations while maintaining their genetic foundation. Unlike many other ethnic groups that were either fully assimilated or displaced, the Siberian Tatars adapted by incorporating newcomers into their society without losing their original identity. This is why their DNA is so valuable, not just for understanding their history, but for reconstructing the ancient past of all of Siberia. Their genetic diversity holds the key to understanding the movement of early humans across Eurasia, the impact of the Great Migrations, and the resilience of indigenous populations in the face of change. They are not just an ethnic group. They are a living record of human history, preserved in their DNA. The DNA of the Siberian Tatars is unlike anything seen in the rest of the Turkic world. While they share a language with other Tatar groups, their genetic makeup tells a completely different story. They are not the descendants of a single migration wave, but a population shaped by thousands of years of interaction between indigenous Siberians and nomadic newcomers. Their genetic signature is so distinct that scientists struggle to place them within any existing category. They are not purely Turkic, not entirely Siberian, and not fully European. Yet they carry traces of all these worlds within them. One of the most striking aspects of their DNA is how much it varies between different subgroups. Unlike the Volga Tatars, who have a relatively homogeneous genetic structure, the Siberian Tatars are one of the most genetically diverse groups in all of Siberia. Some subgroups carry strong Uralic markers, while others show clear connections to the Caucasus, Central Asia, or even Arctic populations. This diversity is not random. It reflects a long history of adaptation to an ever-changing landscape, where different cultures and civilizations merged over time. A major clue to their origins comes from their autosomal DNA, which reveals two distinct ancestral layers. The first layer is deeply Siberian, connecting them to the earliest inhabitants of the region. This component includes genetic ties to ancient hunter-gatherers, Finno-Ugric tribes, and even Paleo-Siberians, who lived in the area long before the first Turkic speakers arrived. The second layer is more recent, showing genetic similarities to Turkic and Iranian-speaking nomads who migrated into the region much later. Unlike other Tatar groups, however, the Siberian Tatars retained much of their ancient Siberian ancestry, making them one of the few populations to preserve these early genetic signatures. Another unique feature of their DNA is the presence of Western Asian genetic components in some groups. This is particularly evident among the Unauthorized Tatars, whose gene pool contains markers more commonly found in the Caucasus and even parts of the Middle East. This suggests that at some point in their history, they had contact with people from far beyond Siberia, possibly through trade routes or the movement of small migrating communities. Meanwhile, the Siberian Bukur Tatars showed genetic links to populations of the Western Caucasus, an unexpected connection that hints at the long-distance interactions that shaped their ancestry. At the same time, other Siberian Tatar subgroups have a completely different genetic story. The Ishtiak Tokus Tatars, for example, retain significant traces of Paleo-Siberian DNA, linking them to some of the earliest people to inhabit the region. This is an extraordinary discovery because it means that while most other indigenous Siberian groups were either absorbed or displaced by later migrations, this lineage has survived within the Siberian Tatars. In other words, their DNA is a direct link to some of the first humans who lived in Siberia thousands of years ago. This deep ancestral connection is further supported by the unique composition of their mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from the maternal line. Unlike their paternal DNA, which shows evidence of migration and mixing, their maternal DNA remains overwhelmingly Siberian. This suggests a historical pattern where Siberian Tatar men descended from various nomadic groups, while their female ancestors were indigenous Siberians. This pattern is rarely seen in other populations, making the Siberian Tatars an important case study for understanding the complex history of human movement across Eurasia. Another unexpected finding is the almost complete absence of strong Mongol genetic influence. Despite their historical connections to the Mongol Empire, their DNA shows only a small percentage, far lower than expected. This contradicts the long-standing belief that the Mongols played a major role in shaping their ancestry. Instead, it appears that the Mongol presence in Siberia was more cultural and political rather than genetic. The Siberian Tatars are not just another ethnic group. They are a living archive of Siberia's past. Their DNA preserves clues about ancient migrations, forgotten civilizations, and the survival of indigenous groups against the forces of history. Every piece of their genetic puzzle reveals something new, making them one of the most fascinating populations in the world. Their uniqueness is not just in their language, culture, or history. It is embedded in their very blood, waiting to be fully understood. For centuries, Siberia has been a land of shifting identities, where cultures, languages, and civilizations have collided and merged. But among the many peoples who have lived here, the Siberian Tatars stand out as a genetic anomaly, one that challenges conventional ideas about ancestry, migration, and ethnicity. Unlike most Turkic groups, whose origins can be traced to the steppe, the Siberian Tatars carry a complex mixture of DNA from multiple, unrelated populations. This is not just the result of historical events. It is a reflection of deep genetic roots that go back thousands of years, connecting them to some of the oldest inhabitants of Siberia. One of the most extraordinary aspects of their DNA is how it defies simple classification. While they speak a Kipchak Turkic language, their genetic heritage suggests a much more diverse ancestry. Some carry markers that link them to Uralic-speaking populations, others to early Iranian and Central Asian groups, and some even to Arctic tribes that have no historical connection to the Turkic world. This means that rather than being a single ethnic group, the Siberian Tatars are a collection of different ancestral lineages that merged over time, forming a population that does not fit neatly into any existing category. A key to their genetic uniqueness lies in their haplogroups, which reveal the deep ancestry of their paternal and maternal lines. The Y-DNA, inherited from their male ancestors, shows that their paternal lineage includes markers found in populations as distant as Western Asia, the Caucasus, and even Eastern Europe. This suggests that male ancestors from different regions contributed to the formation of the Siberian Tatars. But in contrast, their mDNA, inherited from their mothers, tells a very different story, one of continuity with the indigenous peoples of Siberia. This imbalance suggests a historical pattern where nomadic men from different backgrounds settled in Siberia and married indigenous Siberian women, reinforcing their deep connection to the land. But this is only part of the story. Their genetic diversity is not just a result of migration, but also isolation and adaptation. Many Siberian Tatar subgroups, particularly those in remote areas, show evidence of long-term genetic continuity, meaning they have preserved ancient genetic markers that have disappeared in other populations. This is particularly evident in the Zabalatni Tatars, who have retained a genetic structure more similar to Ugric and Samietic peoples than to other Turkic groups. Meanwhile, the Istrotobal Tatars show a genetic imprint of the Shrubnaya culture, an ancient Bronze Age civilization that existed long before the Turkic migrations into Siberia. These findings prove that the Siberian Tatars are not a recent ethnic formation, but rather a population that carries the genetic legacy of civilizations long lost to history. Another important aspect of their genetic identity is their connection to Arctic populations. Unlike most other Turkic-speaking groups, Siberian Tatars show clear links to Paleo-Siberian peoples, some of whom share genetic similarities with indigenous groups from the far north. This suggests that some of their ancestors were part of the ancient populations that first settled Siberia during the last ice age. This is further supported by the presence of rare genetic markers typically found in Arctic and subarctic populations, proving that long before they were Turkic speakers, their ancestors were part of the indigenous world of Siberia. One of the most fascinating genetic discoveries is the unexpected presence of Native American-related ancestry in some Siberian Tatar subgroups. The Baraba Tatars, for example, carry haplogroups that are also found in some Native American populations. This is not evidence of direct contact, but rather a shared ancestral connection, a reminder that thousands of years ago, some of the same people who settled in Siberia also migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. This means that the Siberian Tatars are not just a link between Europe and Asia, but also between the Old World and the New. What makes their genetic story even more remarkable is that, despite their diversity, the Siberian Tatars never fully assimilated into any one group. Unlike many populations that were absorbed by larger empires or lost their distinctiveness over time, they have managed to maintain their genetic identity, even as they adopted elements of Turkic culture and language. This ability to preserve their uniqueness while adapting to changing historical circumstances is one of the reasons their DNA is so valuable. It provides a rare glimpse into the ancient past of Siberia, untouched by the homogenizing forces of modern history. The Siberian Tatars are not just an ethnic group. They are a living archive of Siberia's genetic history, holding traces of civilizations that no longer exist, migrations that shaped the world, and forgotten peoples whose legacy survives only in their DNA. They are proof that history is not just recorded in books. It is written in blood, passed down through generations, waiting to be decoded. The Siberian Tatars are not just another branch of the Turkic world. They are a living record of Siberia's past, carrying genetic traces that stretch across thousands of years and multiple civilizations. Unlike many other ethnic groups whose origins can be traced to a single migration or cultural expansion, the Siberian Tatars are the result of layered ancestry, built through centuries of adaptation, intermarriage, and survival in one of the world's harshest environments. Their DNA holds secrets about the forgotten peoples of Siberia, the movement of early humans across Eurasia, and the resilience of indigenous populations in the face of history's greatest upheavals. One of the most astonishing aspects of their genetic makeup is how widely their ancestry varies from region to region. Unlike Volga Tatars, who share a relatively consistent genetic profile, Siberian Tatars cannot be defined by a single lineage. The Tobalatish Tatars show genetic similarities with early Uralic and Finno-Ugric populations. The Baraba Tatars have strong links to ancient Siberian hunter-gatherers, and the Tom Tatars retain markers that point to early Mongolic and Yeniseian-speaking peoples. This extreme genetic diversity is the result of millennia of population mixing. Yet despite these differences, they have maintained a shared identity through language and culture. The biggest mystery surrounding their ancestry is the missing Mongol genetic influence. Given their historical connections to the Mongol Empire, one would expect their DNA to show significant Mongolic markers. Yet studies have revealed that Mongol ancestry in Siberian Tatars is almost negligible. This directly challenges the long-standing assumption that they were deeply integrated into the Mongol world. Instead, their DNA suggests that they predate the Mongol conquests and were already a well-established population before the Mongols arrived. This means their history is much older than previously believed and may hold the key to understanding the genetic landscape of pre-Mongol Siberia. Another unique feature of their DNA is the presence of a strong Arctic and subarctic genetic component. This is particularly visible in their mitochondrial DNA, which reveals a maternal lineage closely tied to ancient Siberian and Arctic populations. This suggests that while male ancestors may have arrived from different regions, including Central Asia and the Caucasus, the maternal ancestors of the Siberian Tatars were indigenous women whose lineages had been in Siberia for thousands of years. This makes them one of the few populations to have preserved a direct genetic connection to the ancient hunter-gatherers of Siberia, whose genetic traces have largely disappeared in other groups due to assimilation and migration. Even more surprising is the hidden connection between Siberian Tatars and Iranian-speaking steppe nomads. Certain paternal haplogroups found in their DNA are more commonly associated with early Indo-Iranian populations rather than Turkic or Mongolic groups. This means that before they adopted a Turkic language, some of their ancestors may have belonged to the Iranian-speaking nomadic cultures of Central Asia, such as the Scythians or the Sarmatians. This suggests that the Siberian Tatars were not always a Turkic people, but underwent language replacement while retaining the genetic legacy of their earlier ancestors. Their autosomal DNA, which represents the overall genetic influence of all ancestors, further supports this complex picture. Unlike purely Turkic groups, whose genetic profiles show dominant Central Asian ancestry, Siberian Tatars have a much higher percentage of West Eurasian and Siberian ancestry. This proves that rather than being the result of a single migration from the steppe, they were shaped by multiple migrations over thousands of years. Their ancestors included not just Turkic-speaking nomads, but also Paleo-Siberians, Finno-Ugric tribes, Iranian-speaking horsemen, and indigenous hunter-gatherers. But one of the most shocking discoveries is their genetic link to ancient Beringian populations, the people who once inhabited the land bridge between Siberia and North America during the Ice Age. While this connection is not strong enough to suggest direct ancestry, it does indicate that some of their distant ancestors were part of the same prehistoric populations that eventually migrated into the Americas. This means that the Siberian Tatars are not just a genetic bridge between Europe and Asia, but also between the Old World and the New. Despite this astonishing diversity, Siberian Tatars have managed to maintain their identity across centuries of change. While other populations were either absorbed into larger empires or lost their distinctiveness due to assimilation, the Siberian Tatars adapted without losing their genetic uniqueness. Their ability to preserve ancient lineages while embracing new influences is what makes them one of the most fascinating genetic case studies in the world. The Siberian Tatars are not just a historical curiosity. They are a living mosaic of Eurasia's past, carrying the bloodlines of peoples who have long since vanished, yet whose DNA survives in them. Their genetic story is a reminder that history is not just written in books. It is inscribed in our very DNA, waiting to be uncovered. The Siberian Tatars are often grouped with other Turkic peoples, but their DNA reveals a completely different story, one that defies easy classification. Unlike most Turkic-speaking populations, whose genetic origins can be traced to the Central Asian steppe, the Siberian Tatars possess a distinct genetic blueprint shaped by an astonishing range of influences. Their DNA carries traces of civilizations long forgotten, migrations that shaped entire continents, and survival strategies that allowed them to endure in one of the world's harshest environments. One of the most surprising discoveries about their genetic structure is the presence of ancient Siberian ancestry that has remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. While most populations in Siberia have undergone significant genetic shifts due to waves of migration, Siberian Tatars have preserved markers from some of the region's earliest inhabitants. These genetic signatures link them to hunter-gatherers who lived in the area before the rise of major steppe empires, proving that their ancestors were deeply rooted in Siberia long before the arrival of Turkic nomads. This continuity is particularly evident in certain isolated subgroups, such as the Zabalatni Tatars, whose genetic profile remains distinct even from other Siberian Tatars. Unlike other Tatar subgroups, they carry a significant percentage of haplogroups associated with Uralic and Samoyedic populations, suggesting that their ancestors may have been closely related to the indigenous peoples of western Siberia. This makes them a rare genetic window into the distant past, offering clues about how early human populations adapted to the Siberian landscape. But while some groups retain strong connections to Siberia's original inhabitants, others absorb genetic influences from far beyond the region. The Unauthorized Tatars, for instance, show an unusual genetic affinity with Caucasian and Western Asian populations. This suggests that at some point in their history, they had significant contact with groups from much warmer climates, possibly through trade or migration. The presence of genetic markers common in the Caucasus hints at an ancient connection that is still not fully understood, one that challenges the traditional narrative of Siberia being isolated from the rest of Eurasia. Another striking feature of their DNA is the high degree of genetic differentiation between their subgroups. Unlike populations that share a relatively uniform genetic structure, the Siberian Tatars exhibit some of the highest levels of internal genetic diversity among all Turkic-speaking peoples. The Tam Tatars, for example, show a genetic connection to Yeniseian-speaking groups, while the Baraba Tatars have a composition that includes elements of early steppe civilizations. These differences suggest that instead of being a single, unified people, the Siberian Tatars are actually a collection of distinct ancestral groups that came together over time, each contributing its own genetic heritage to the population. Even more fascinating is their unexpected connection to the Arctic and subarctic peoples. While they are often classified as a Turkic group, their mitochondrial DNA tells a different story, one that links them to populations living in some of the coldest and most remote regions of the world. Genetic markers commonly found among Arctic indigenous groups, such as the Evenks and the Chukchi, have been detected in certain Siberian Tatar subgroups. This suggests that some of their maternal ancestors may have belonged to ancient Arctic populations that once roamed the vast Siberian tundra, long before the first Turkic migrations into the region. But perhaps the biggest mystery in their DNA is the absence of a strong Mongolic genetic component. Given that the Mongol Empire once controlled much of Siberia, One would expect the Siberian Tatars to carry significant Mongolic ancestry, yet genetic studies show that this influence is surprisingly minor. This challenges long-held assumptions about their history, suggesting that rather than being a product of Mongol expansion, the Siberian Tatars were already an established population before the Mongols arrived. It also raises the question of why they adopted a Turkic language rather than preserving the indigenous tongues spoken by their ancestors. What makes their genetic story even more intriguing is how well they have preserved their unique genetic identity despite centuries of external pressures. While many indigenous Siberian groups either disappeared or were assimilated into larger populations, the Siberian Tatars managed to survive as a distinct people. Their ability to adapt while maintaining genetic continuity is rare, especially in a region that has seen massive historical disruptions. The Siberian Tatars are not just another ethnic group. They are a genetic archive of Siberia's forgotten past, containing pieces of history that cannot be found in written records. Their DNA tells a story of survival, adaptation, and resilience, proving that human history is far more complex than we ever imagined. Their existence challenges our understanding of Siberia's past and offers new insights into the deep and often unexpected connections between the peoples of Eurasia. The Siberian Tatars hold a genetic legacy unlike any other in Eurasia. While their language and cultural identity connect them to the broader Turkic world, their DNA tells a story that is far more intricate, revealing ancient migrations, unexpected influences, and the survival of prehistoric bloodlines. They are not simply descendants of steppe nomads, nor are they entirely indigenous to Siberia. Instead, they are the product of thousands of years of genetic layering, shaped by climatic changes, trade networks, and the ebb and flow of empires. One of the most striking revelations about their genetic ancestry is the deep divide between their paternal and maternal lineages. While Y chromosome data suggests that many Siberian Tatar men descend from Turkic and even Iranian-speaking steppe warriors, their mitochondrial DNA tells a completely different story. The maternal lineages of the Siberian Tatars are overwhelmingly Siberian, linked to some of the region's most ancient populations. This suggests a historical pattern in which incoming male migrants married into indigenous Siberian communities, resulting in a unique blend of Turkic, Iranian, and Paleo-Siberian ancestry. Adding to this complexity is the presence of genetic markers linked to ancient Central Asian civilizations. Certain paternal haplogroups found among Siberian Tatars are also found in the remains of people who lived in the region thousands of years ago, particularly those associated with the Andronovo and Shrubnaya cultures, two major Bronze Age civilizations that existed long before the first Turkic migrations. This suggests that some of the ancestors of Siberian Tatars may have been part of these early Indo-European cultures before later waves of migration introduced Turkic languages to the region. What is particularly unique about their genetic structure is the strong presence of haplogroups typically found among Ugric and Samoyedic peoples. While most Turkic-speaking populations show little genetic connection to Uralic-speaking groups, the Siberian Tatars are an exception. This connection is especially strong in isolated subgroups, such as the Zabolotny Tatars, who carry a genetic imprint that aligns more closely with the Khanty, Mansi, and Nenets than with other Turkic groups. This suggests that in certain regions, rather than completely replacing the indigenous Ugric populations, the early ancestors of the Siberian Tatars merged with them, preserving some of their genetic heritage. Another surprising discovery is their lack of genetic uniformity. Unlike other Tatar groups, whose gene pools tend to be relatively stable across different regions, the Siberian Tatars exhibit a highly fragmented genetic structure. The Tobalar-Tish Tatars, for example, show traces of ancestry linked to early Finno-Ugric groups, while the Baraba Tatars display a mix of Siberian and steppe influences. Meanwhile, the Tom Tatars have retained genetic markers that suggest connections to ancient Yeniseian-speaking peoples, a language family that has almost completely vanished today. This extreme diversity indicates that instead of being a single, unified ethnic group, the Siberian Tatars are actually a collection of genetically distinct subgroups that formed through different historical processes. One of the most fascinating elements of their DNA is the presence of rare East Eurasian genetic components typically found in Mongolic, Tungusic, and even Arctic populations. Certain haplogroups found among the Siberian Tatars have direct parallels in Buryats, Evenks, and Yakuts, suggesting a distant connection to the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of Siberia and Mongolia. However, despite this, the Siberian Tatars have far less Mongolic genetic influence than expected, further reinforcing the idea that their history is far older than the Mongol Empire. This genetic puzzle raises an important question. How do they retain their distinct identity despite centuries of external influences? Unlike many indigenous Siberian groups that were gradually assimilated into larger populations, the Siberian Tatars managed to maintain a unique genetic and cultural identity, even as they adopted Turkic language and traditions. This ability to preserve their ancestral diversity while integrating new influences makes them one of the most unique case studies in human genetics. The Siberian Tatars are not just a footnote in the history of the Turkic world. They are a living bridge between the past and present, carrying genetic traces of civilizations that have long since disappeared. Their DNA preserves evidence of forgotten migrations, lost languages, and the survival of some of Siberia's earliest inhabitants. Every genetic study conducted on them continues to reveal new and unexpected connections, proving that the human past is far more complex than history books alone can tell us. The Siberian Tatars are often seen as just another branch of the Turkic world, but their genetic identity is unlike any other. Their DNA carries the footprints of migrations that shaped not only Siberia, but the entire Eurasian landmass. What sets them apart is that they are not a singular people with a single origin, but rather a fusion of multiple ancient populations, each leaving behind a unique genetic imprint that has been preserved for centuries. One of the most fascinating aspects of their ancestry is the presence of deeply rooted Siberian genetic markers that predate the Turkic migrations. While they speak a Turkic language today, their genetics reveal that a large portion of their ancestry comes from non-Turkic indigenous populations that lived in Siberia long before the Turkic expansion. This means that their shift to a Turkic identity was not driven by genetics, but by cultural and linguistic evolution. Even more surprising is the lack of dominance from any single ancestral source. Unlike other groups whose genetic makeup can be traced to a few key migrations, the Siberian Tatars show evidence of multiple historical layers. The Iskir Tatars, for example, carry genetic markers that tie them to ancient Bronze Age cultures of the Ural region, while the Tom Tatars have a profile that suggests a deep link to the now-extinct Yeniseian-speaking tribes. Meanwhile, the Baraba Tatars show an unexpected genetic influence from early Arctic populations, indicating ancient contact with groups that once thrived in the subarctic regions of Eurasia. One of the biggest mysteries in their DNA is how they managed to retain their distinct genetic identity despite centuries of external pressures. Unlike other Siberian groups that were absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire or assimilated into larger Turkic populations, the Siberian Tatars remain genetically unique, even as they adapted to new cultural influences. This is particularly impressive, given their long history of interaction with neighboring Ugric, Iranian, and Mongolic-speaking peoples. A key part of their genetic puzzle is the presence of rare Y-DNA haplogroups that are uncommon in most Turkic populations. While many Turkic groups show a strong genetic connection to Central Asia, the Siberian Tatars have a much more diverse paternal lineage, including markers linked to early Indo-European, Uralic, and Siberian hunter-gatherer groups. This suggests that their male ancestors came from a wide range of backgrounds, reinforcing the idea that they were not a single migrating people, but rather a population formed through centuries of integration and adaptation. Even their autosomal DNA, which represents the combined genetic influence of all ancestors, proves that their origins cannot be tied to just one region. Instead, their genome is a mosaic of ancient Siberian, Eurasian steppe, and Arctic influences, making them one of the most genetically diverse Turkic-speaking populations. This diversity is also reflected in their physical traits, with some subgroups showing features that resemble early Finno-Ugric populations, while others bear closer similarities to Central Asian nomads. Another major discovery is their unexpected genetic link to prehistoric populations that once inhabited the vast Siberian tundra. Some of their mitochondrial DNA haplogroups trace back to groups that lived in Siberia thousands of years ago, long before the rise of any major civilization. These findings suggest that the maternal ancestors of the Siberian Tatars may have belonged to some of the earliest human populations to settle in the region, possibly even surviving the extreme conditions of the Ice Age. But what makes their story even more remarkable is that despite their deep roots in Siberia, they never remained isolated. Over the centuries, they played a critical role in trade, migration, and cultural exchange across Eurasia, which is why their DNA contains traces of genetic influence from as far west as the Caucasus and as far east as Mongolia. Yet, instead of being absorbed into these larger groups, they maintained their own unique identity, a testament to their resilience and adaptability. The Siberian Tatars are not just a historical footnote in the Turkic world. They are a genetic time capsule, preserving the ancestry of multiple ancient civilizations that have long disappeared. Their DNA challenges everything we thought we knew about migration, identity, and survival in Siberia. The more we study them, the clearer it becomes. They are not just descendants of nomads, but living proof of how human history is far more interconnected than we ever imagined.